Hello and welcome to episode number 50 of the Motherhood podcast. This is new and exciting because we've never done video before. So apologies in advance if there's any glitches or if our lighting and camera quality isn't the greatest. This is the very first time that we're doing it. And for the 50th episode, I thought it would be really fun to have a chat with one of my really good childhood friends, Melissa Wetzel. We've known each other since we were, 3 years old, I think.
3 years old. Yep.
Just another thing that I'm dragging her into. But it would be really fun, I thought, to talk about the history of motherhood. Melissa has a background in HR. That's what she's currently working in right now, and psychology. And she's working on her MBA. And she's also a mother to little ones in heaven. And I just thought that she would be a really good person to just have this kind of chat, both from a psychological standpoint and an anthropological standpoint on motherhood, just to kind of get rid of mom guilt that a lot of us have when we don't feel like we're measuring up to the modern standard of what it means to be a mother. And also just to put it kind of into context of women, what they've been doing for thousands of years versus what moms are doing currently. Because I think a lot of times we always measure ourselves against either the Instagram mom or our own moms or our grandmothers, and we don't really realize in the day-to-day living of being a mom that motherhood has been around for centuries. And to put it even more into context and into a better context, I thought it would be great to just kind of look at the history of it and then also dive into more ancient history, modern history, and then also shame, which is a big aspect of motherhood and seems to have always been around. So Melissa, thanks for joining us on this experiment today. So maybe you could just tell everyone a little bit about yourself, and feel free to take some jabs at me too if you.
As Emily mentioned, we've known each other since we were 3 years old. We lived on the same cul-de-sac, so we got into some hijinks as children. I specifically remember home videos, mud pies, me fabricating stories of a burglar in your garage. That's always the classic one. Fights like sisters. So all the fun things that you do growing up, and I always love that we stayed in touch, of course, and we have very different paths, but we always come back to the same values that we share, and of course that friendship that we've built upon. I am getting my MBA right now. I'm at USC. I've been in HR for a lot of my career. My background initially was in psychology, and I wanted to do research, but that just wasn't my calling. I'd been in corporate America since I was 18, and I really felt very at home in business. However, as Emily mentioned, I did have a miscarriage, and I, even though I'm not officially considered a mother, this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I have friends who are mothers. My sister, I have a lovely niece, and kind of what we're going to talk about, especially the shame aspect, is something I think that no matter what your background is, it kind of unites women all together. So yeah, looking forward to kind of digging into this and talking more about it.
When I asked you to do this episode a little over a week ago, which was completely last minute, as with a lot of things that I tend to do, it's funny because I just kind of had a flashback to our childhood when I decided I wanted to make movies with our camcorder. I don't even remember how old we were, like 10 or 12 or something like that. And you were just so game to do that. And here it is, like over 20 years later, and you're still just, sure, I'll do this random episode with you. And you're down for that. So I really appreciate that. That's really cool. Oh, okay. So for the intro, we wanted to play for you this. It's a clip. I guess the company called Card Store, they actually posted a fake job interview for what they called the interview for the world's toughest job. And I just wanted to play this for you because I think a lot of you will resonate with it.
Over the camera before? No. Let me tell you a little bit about the job to get started with. It's not just a job. It's sort of probably the most important job. The title that we have going right now is Director of Operations, but it's really kind of so much more than that. Responsibilities and requirements are really quite extensive. First category for the requirements would be mobility. This job requires that you must be able to work standing up most or really all of the time, constantly on your feet, constantly bending over, constantly exerting yourself, a high level of stamina. Okay.
That's a lot. For how many hours?
135 hours to unlimited hours a week. It's basically 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
I'm sure you'll have a chance from time to time to maybe just sit down here and there, yeah?
You mean like a break?
Yeah.
No, there are no breaks available.
Is that even legal?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So like no lunch?
You can have lunch, but only when the associate is done eating their lunch.
I think that's a little intense.
No,
not possible.
That's crazy.
Now, this position requires excellent negotiation and interpersonal skill. We're really looking for someone that might have a degree in medicine, in finance, and the culinary arts. You must be able to wear several hats. Associate needs constant attention. Sometimes they have to stay up with an associate throughout the night. Being able to work in a chaotic environment, if you had a life, we'd ask you to sort of give that life up. No vacations. In fact, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, and holidays, the workload is going to go up, and we demand that with a happy disposition.
That's almost cruel. That's almost a very, very sick, twisted joke.
But when there's time to sleep or...
Oh, no time to sleep.
Yeah, all-encompassing almost.
That's exactly right.
365 days a year?
Yes.
No, that's inhumane.
That's very insane.
The meaningful connections that you make and the feeling that you get from really helping your associate are immeasurable. Also, let's cover the salary. The position is going to pay absolutely nothing.
Excuse me?
No. Nobody's doing that for free.
Yeah, pro bono. Completely for free.
No.
What if I told you there's someone that actually currently holds this position right now? Billions of people, actually.
Who?
Moms.
It's so funny when you listen to it because no one would ever actually accept that kind of job when you're just, when you have the job description be just like any other job that exists. But then for moms, we just do it and then don't even think about it. And then when you realize that that is what they're talking about, it all makes sense and clicks. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
So I remember seeing it when it first came out, but listening to it again, like you said, if you don't know what to expect, you're like, well, what kind of terrible position is this? I mean, who would ever take anything like that? It also reminds me, I think it was Benadryl that had a commercial about when you're a parent, there's no sick days. Your kid can have sick days, but you're not allowed to have any sick days. And so it really, hones in on the fact that it is a 24/7 job. And yes, there's obviously a lot of great things that can come out of it. But, when it's just you and significant other, sometimes there is no significant other. I mean, it is it's probably the toughest job to make sure that your child is raised and turns out to be a functioning adult.
Definitely. There's a New York Times opinion piece that I came across about a year ago. The title is Early Motherhood Has Always Been Miserable by Jessica Gross, which isn't the best title, but I'm sure every mom has felt that at some point in early motherhood. But it was pretty interesting. What she was talking about is that there's always been two diametrically opposed concepts of motherhood that dominate conversations in America today. And just as we were saying at the very beginning, that there's the Instagram influencers' vision of the ideal mother with the perfectly groomed and smiling children, that everything always looks perfect. And then there's the gritty real talk of comedians and writers like Ali Wong. And I'm not sure if you've heard of like the scary mommy, those sorts of type of more raw motherhood stories. And so the opinion piece talks about how there's been tension between the ideal and the real for over 200 years. And there's been some sort of version of the pristine influencer mother that has been pushed on American women since the 1800s. And in her opinion, she said that that's always been a lie, because if you look back through the diaries and journals of middle and upper class women during that time, you'll see that they've always been talking about the difficulty and reality of motherhood ever since the idea took hold that women were supposed to feel fulfilled by their maternal roles. So we'll have that article linked in the show notes and also reference it throughout this episode if you're curious about reading what the diaries of these women are. But as we'll mention later in the episode too, that only captures what the upper and middle class women and mothers were experiencing and not really the lower class, which is a really important aspect to look at as well. And Melissa, I know that you recently found a Washington Post opinion piece that was talking about something similar.
Yeah, it's amazing, the literature that's out there, and we don't even think about it, having all of this at our fingertips. But I actually came across this, again, a little while ago, and we'll link this, article as well. But it's the idea, of a good mom should always be busy, selfless, and cheerfully obedient. It's kind of peppered throughout history and culture. I do want to note that when they say peppered throughout history and culture, really, though, as Emily said, the last 200 years, this idea of like the, perfect mom coming to the fore, and we'll dive into a little bit more later. But, Sharon Hayes, she's a sociologist, and she wrote a book in 1986 called The Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood, which really shows that the definition of proper parenting, has always been slightly out of reach, keeping mothers off balance and striving for something that really is not attainable and something that has just been exacerbated with social media. And this isn't to bring down women who utilize social media, especially if, they're doing their thing, trying to make money. It just, I think for a majority of people, it's something that they cannot reach themselves. I do know of a couple of accounts that really hone in on the, mothers should always be busy, selfless, and cheerfully obedient. Really the whole self-sacrificing if you're a parent. And yes, there is self-sacrificing when you are a mom, but I look at someone like my sister who is completely self-sacrificing. Emily, I would say you're the same. A lot of moms are, and to constantly be cheerful, I think is reaching a goal that you can just never reach. There's no such thing as being happy 24/7. And I think that women would be driven mad if we really try to achieve that, to be honest.
So those are really good points. And I like too that you mentioned that there's nothing wrong with that perfect mom lifestyle, or if you are an influencer or something like that, that I think that is a really good disclaimer that we should put out there that, this is just our opinions and our reflections, and also that we're not judging any particular mom, because there are the Pinterest type moms. Like I know someone who is a Pinterest mom, and she truly enjoys and loves and thrives in that. And I'm really impressed with that. And so I think that's awesome that she can be that Pinterest mom, but a lot of us aren't that way. And it's important that we don't feel guilty because we aren't living up to those Pinterest mom standards. Again, like not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but just that for the rest of us, or for the majority of us who can't do that, we shouldn't feel guilty because we aren't that way. So I think that that's a really good intro for then diving into our first point, looking at the historical look, taking a historical look at motherhood, and just looking at, okay, well, how have moms been doing their job as a mom since the beginning of history, which I always had a gut feeling about what moms did, hundreds of years, thousands of years ago. But I never was really entirely sure until I just decided to do some research actually for this episode. And that's another disclaimer that we should probably give, is that we're just doing this amateur, we're not historians or that sort of thing. And everything that we pulled from online, yes, they are from really good reputable sources. But again, a lot of it's opinionated, or some of it we just don't know and have the full story with. But since the beginning of time, it does seem like that women have always worked, and that being a stay-at-home mom is more of a modern day phenomenon. And there's a Britannica encyclopedia entry called Women in the Workforce. And it says that for much of written history, that agriculture was always a main occupation for both men and women, but that the heavy physical labor was not just confined to men, and that women actually did a lot of heavy physical labor, and such as grinding grain by hand in a stone quern, drawing and carrying water, gathering wood, and churning milk to make butter. And the only time women got a break from these sorts of heavy labor activities was when a woman gave birth, which is crazy to think about. and digging a little bit deeper into specific time periods that during hunter-gatherer times, and this is from an entry in the Anthropology Oxford Research Encyclopedia called Hunter-Gatherer Women. I thought that it was pretty interesting that women would be responsible mostly for gathering the plants and that men would often hunt game or meat. And it does get into a lot greater detail in this article, but they did say that it was tribe specific on what women did as opposed to men. For example, some women in some tribes actually did join men on the hunts to assist in various capacities, whether it was like a tracker, those sorts of things. And women who lived in coastal communities, they would fish just like the men would, which I found pretty interesting. So there wasn't really like one universal occupation that that women had during the hunter-gatherer stage, but it's just kind of interesting to note that women did as much as they could, it just as the men did. So it wasn't just kind of like women staying at home and then men going out to be providers and then women just so isolated and alone at home. And another thing that I thought was really interesting to note was that the hunter-gatherer women, they often maintain strong cooperative partnerships with closely related females, usually mothers and sisters, to optimize the household production. And so whenever a mom couldn't care for her children, then, there would be another woman in the community who could come in and look and take care of the children. And that the concept of Aloe Parenting, which Merriam-Webster defines as an individual other than the biological parent of an offspring, performing the functions of a parent, also known as daycare nannies or babysitters. So Aloe Parenting has actually been around for hundreds of thousands of years. So it's not just a modern concept that moms might need a nanny or daycare or babysitter to have to go out and do something else. So I thought that was really interesting as well. So I'm not sure if, Melissa, you want to chime in on any of that.
I mean, the history is fascinating when you really look, for how long humanity has been around and how short of a time we really have talked about what the perfect mom, perfect parent is. Because as you said, women were very involved in the day-to-day life of running the house, not just running the household and raising children, but also being active in helping their spouse out. I think it's also important to note, especially that even later on, especially during the Industrial Revolution, which I know we'll touch upon, but women, especially of lower classes, were not given the luxury to just do nothing, especially when the great migrations to cities, you think about how women were working in factories as well. So, to kind of just keep going on that thread, I mean, there's a lot to Aloe Parenting. I kind of did a little, I'd heard of it, but I never really, delved into it a lot. But there's a lot of fascinating information. And again, I think it's worth noting that this is something that I think throughout, the history of humanity, this was the norm, more or less. You always have exceptions, but how much we've changed as a society and how we viewed parenting, especially when you look at when during the Industrial Revolution, when we started getting better nutrition, people started living longer, how that really changed things for us. I kind of wanted to dive in a little bit to, some examples, if that's okay. I don't want to talk about ancient Egypt for a second here. So ancient Egypt is fascinating. I know everyone's heard of it, but they're one of the societies at the time where women had probably the best rights of any other civilization during that time period. Women could own land, initiate divorce, own and operate their own business, become scribes, priests, seers, dentists, doctors. Men were still dominant. You'll still read about that, and they held the most important roles. But as a general rule, there is evidence that women also had authority even over men. We can always like link some of this information as well. But I really think the takeaway from this is that women weren't confined to just the home, even back in ancient civilizations where we think of women not having as many rights. Obviously, this is a Western perspective that I'm coming from, but women today, we consider ourselves having the most rights of any time in any point in history, and that may be true in a lot of ways. But women, had autonomy at different points in their lives. Ancient Egypt is a classic example of that. They obviously still took care of the house, but they were free to leave their responsibilities to a servant or other female family members and pursue interests outside of the house. Ancient Israel is another one. I think you found this here. It was from Oxford University, entitled 11 Things About Women in Ancient Israel You Probably Didn't Know. And I didn't know either. So this was actually a really fun read. Women were responsible for transforming raw materials into food and clothing. These are just some highlights, of course. There's a lot going on. Women may have had significant amount of control of the household's material resources. They're most likely named their children other than the fathers. They worked as midwives, medical specialists. Women were even prophets. You look at the Hebrew Bible, you have Miriam, Deborah, Huldah, the unnamed prophetess of Isaiah. They're all women identified as prophets in the Hebrew Bible. And a lot of that's always glossed over, especially if you take into account religion. People always look at it as a very male-dominated area, but women were there. Women had a presence. And I think that's important to know. And we always ask ourselves, why are we bringing this up? Because I think a lot of women get stuck, especially today with social media involved and other medias as well, that they have to be in this box in order to be successful or to be viewed successfully. That they are selfish if they pursue interests outside of, their children and their home. Even women who work feel guilty for leaving their kids or maybe putting them in daycare. Some women don't have the luxury to feel guilty because they're the sole provider. So I think it's always good to look back at our history, where we came from, because that tells us a lot. And again, these are just, classic examples. You'll find them all over. You can always explore other countries as well. Vikings, the Viking history has a very interesting, take on how women in their society was as well. So moving on from that, though, Emily, you want to take women in Middle Ages? Do you think you found that as well?
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting that you mentioned the Vikings, because my husband and I are watching, now I'm blanking on it. I think it's, The Last Kingdom. It's actually a pretty good show.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yes, I love that show.
It's pretty addicting, that we've been binge watching it after the kids go to bed a few days a week. But basically the women, at least according to the show, and I haven't done like a ton of research, but it seems like the women were allowed to fight alongside the men, and it wasn't a big deal at all. They're just fighting, which is kind of awesome. So, but I think that really is a really good point that you brought up. Like, why are we talking about this? It is to help with the mom guilt, because when a lot of us moms, and I fall into this trap all the time, we think that, to be the perfect mom, that we always have to be there present in our child's lives 24/7, or at least a good chunk of the day. And we feel guilty when we're doing something that's other than being a mother. But then we think of the traditional, and I put traditional in quotes, we think of the traditional mom as being there all the time, 100% of the time for your children. But then when we look back at these examples that we're giving in ancient times, that it's rarely been the case in the history of humanity that women have been able to just sit and be there for their children 100% of the time, because they had lots of jobs to do. And it was, I thought it was crazy, even in ancient Egypt, that women were responsible for brewing beer for a while. I was like, I just never associated that with something that moms would do. But yeah, going on to women in the Middle Ages, this was kind of interesting to dive into this aspect as well. So women in the Middle Ages, it's a very complex subject to dive into, because the Middle Ages lasted for so long. There's different periods of the Middle Ages, and a lot of things happened, and a lot of it depended on where you lived too. So that obviously, there was a lot of variation in that aspect as well. So women held the positions of wife, mother, peasant, artisan, nun, and they were able to have leadership roles when they did decide to enter a convent, such as an abbess or queen regent. That was another type of leadership role that some women, obviously only if you're royalty, you could have that kind of authority. going into the non-traditional mother, because I guess we could say that, nuns are spiritual mothers. So that's actually an important aspect to look at. So starting in the 5th century, that women could enter a monastery, and that there's actually a lot of really famous nuns that lived during the Middle Ages. One is Hilda of Whitby. She was an influential on a national and even international scale, and she was abbess at several monasteries. And I guess a lot of kings even came to her for advice because she was famous for her wisdom. And then there's Hildegard of Bingen. She was a German Benedictine abbess, writer, composer, philosopher, Christian mystic, visionary, and polymath. I had to Google this because I didn't know what that was. I guess it's just someone who knows several subjects very well, such as Leonardo da Vinci. And then there's also theologians that lived during the Middle Ages, really important theologians. There's St. Catherine of Siena and St. Teresa of Avila, who are now recognized as doctors of the Roman Catholic Church. So even though these aren't mothers in, I guess, the traditional sense of having biological children, they're still mothers of, spiritual mothers, those sorts of things. Those who were biological mothers, they had a lot of jobs as well. Spinning was a woman's craft, as was brewing, interesting to note, and that married women were often expected to help in their husband's business. So it was a partnership where they both worked in their husband's business many times. And that a lot of women, there are instances that they found of women having their own businesses independent of their husbands. So that's kind of interesting to note as well. And then going back to the Washington Post opinion piece that we mentioned earlier, the author mentions that for centuries in Europe, that child rearing was a socially devalued task and often outsourced to wet nurses, nannies, and boarding schools. And then it wasn't until, recently in the past couple hundred years that breastfeeding was, there's a really big push for breastfeeding and affectionate mothering, and it fostered something called the cult of true womanhood. And then in Puritan New England, that raising children was about guiding their spiritual development, and mothers were supposed to follow the rules set by authoritarian fathers. And that gave rise to what's called like a moral mothering, urging moms to trust their instincts to bring out a child's inner goodness. So it's all kind of interesting learning about the different, the different movements within motherhood, because then we can recognize those ideals or ideas, I guess is a better word for ideas, in our head. So when those start to crop up, we can think, oh, well, maybe I wonder if that's true, or maybe that's just hearkening to that thought of motherhood back in the day, or back hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, I want to just touch one really quick, because I found it so crazy that women brewed beer. I think we should just like, now we don't have to talk about it, but I just love that. I mean, you think of like how that has become a man's domain, and you think of cooking as well. Like a lot of the top chefs, not so much anymore, but they were men, but you were always told like, the kitchen is a woman's place, and it's kind of how that's flipped on its head. So props to all the beer brewers who were women back in the day. I think that's so great.
Yeah. I'm sure a lot of bros would be surprised at that,
Yeah,
So just
that. Oh yeah, and you think of like your tavern wench, not to get crass on it, but it's what all that entailed, and I'm sure brewing beer was part of it. I'm talking out of turn on that. I don't have a citation for it specifically, but especially when you consider who did it. So
right.
I just thought that was great. So women, we can do whatever we want. Nothing's out of our reach here. I wanted to kind of, you mentioned the New York Times piece, and I think it's also, something that should be mentioned, for thousands of years, children all started to work when they were 6 or 7 years old. Again, it wasn't really until life expectancy first started in Western civilization, then later other areas caught up where, kids had the luxury of being home. Not all classes obviously could indulge in this. Even today, that may not be the case all over the world. So this obviously is still a very, this is a Western perspective, but we are in America, and you'll still find examples, throughout the world of similar things happening with women. And I think media nowadays too has, kind of caught up and shown us where the trajectory is of how parenting is. And women, I think that's a great unifying factor. Women are so different. We all have different needs, different backgrounds. But I think when it comes to motherhood and, how we are looked upon as people and how women should act in the home, I think that is a very unifying thing for women across the board, more or less. And that kind of brings us into, the modern look at womanhood. Did you want to start this off, or do you want me to go ahead and do that?
Oh, you can go ahead and take that one.
All right. So modern motherhood, this is, while history is great, it's always, because we live in the here and now, this is always, I think, where things get fun. Because again, I mentioned the Industrial Revolution, changed the work situation for both men and women. Whereas the hearth and home had been the center of production and family life, industrialization changed the locus of work from home to factory. The role of women in the family workforce did not change overnight, obviously, but for the first time, many families worked together in factories as teams. And it really wasn't until until the mid 19th century, under the role of the male as the good provider emerged, with women taking over most household and domestic tasks. This transition may have stemmed from the growing humanitarian protests against the harsh treatment of women and children in early factories. I also want to note, though, too, that as people's incomes rose and middle class came about, I think advertisement really also started to have an effect on how we started viewing things. That is a whole separate discussion that we could probably talk ad nauseum about. But and I think that's really where early media came into play for families and how women started to be perceived. Because up until that point, you had obviously philosophical books, learnings, teachings. You had the church, but advertising, we can never, minimize the impact of how that affected things. So, just to kind of cap that off really quick, there's also legislation, most notably in Britain, raised the minimum age for child labor in factories. It set limits on working hours for women and children and barred them from certain dangerous and heavy occupations. So women were engaged primarily in domestic tasks, such as childcare, and men went to work, being the sole wage earner. On the surface, these aren't bad things necessarily. Having children not be worked to death in factories, not bad. Having women not be worked to death in factories, also not bad. But there's always these unintended consequences, of course. So what we ended up happening is, it really reinforced the man as being the sole wage earner in the family, and his traditional position as the head of the family. So just a lot to unpack there, of course. I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to add to that, Emily.
Yeah, it does seem like from everything that I was reading that it really seems like the idea of the traditional mother really stems from this time period that we're talking about right now, when the men would more work outside of the home, and then, just as you were saying, because of the laws that were passed, and also just because of advertising, or maybe just a combination of everything, and then women would just more stay in the home. And that is what I think, at least it seems to me, in my opinion, from my perspective, that what most moms, when they think of traditional motherhood, they think of this time period that we're talking about right now. And going back to the New York Times opinion piece that we mentioned at the beginning of the episode by Jessica Gross, that she gives a little quick history of the expectations of mothers throughout the centuries and the modern era. So she says in colonial America that women helped run the family farm or small business, and the older siblings or servants raised the younger siblings. And it wasn't until the 19th century, just as you said, Melissa, that when the economic production moved outside of the home, that this cult of womanhood, as historians call it, emerged. And that it was this idea that men worked, and that it was morally superior for middle-class women to keep home and the family pure. And that women beginning in the Victorian era were then expected to find exclusive fulfillment in their children. So this is really, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, this is where it's at. I think this is where a lot of us get trapped in our mom guilt, because we're like, well, this is how moms are supposed to be. This is it. This is it. And it's crazy that this is just it for one moment in all of motherhood history. We just talked about ancient history, and how even from the beginning of time, hunter-gatherer, ancient Egypt, ancient Israel, the Vikings, and all these sorts of things, all these different jobs that mothers held. And then, fast forward to modern time, it's this single moment in time, the 19th century, that we created this ideal version of motherhood. And then that's where we place our mom guilt on, which is kind of fascinating.
Yeah, the Victorian era is the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, we take for granted so much of what happened then, including obviously we had 2 world wars. All of it stemmed from the beginning, the Victorian era and the politics that were there, and that includes the family. And we're still, again, I go, early advertisements towards women. It's all from the Victorian era, and there's obviously good and bad no matter where you go, but Victorian era is definitely, like you said, Emily, where this all really began of how we kind of see the modern mother. And we've come so far since then, but in a lot of ways, we're still in this weird zone of, hyper mothering, especially if you work. That's kind of jumping ahead a little bit. So I want to refer to the Washington Post article, which saw the 20th century saw scientific mothering, which encouraged schedules, letting babies cry it out rather than soothing them. And sound familiar to any moms here? And of course, emotional distance. That era was followed by child-centered mothering, later criticized as smother mothering. The Goldbergs, by the way, is
or
a great
parenting.
Yes, about this great smother, or the precursor to the helicopter mom, whatever you want to call it.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly.
And then of course you have,
and then there's the benign.
Yep.
Oh, then there's the benign neglect of the 1960s. And I have this great Jerry Seinfeld quote that I'd love to play for you. I don't know how many of you are Jerry Seinfeld fans, but this is from his Jerry Before Seinfeld series on Netflix, which is pretty funny. But he's basically talking about how he grew up in the 1960s. And this is just kind of to reinforce how during that time period, for whatever reason, it was really in vogue to neglect your children.
My parents didn't even know our names. They were ignorant. They were negligent. We grew up like wild dogs in the 60s. No helmets, no seatbelts, no restraints. Cookie Crisp. It's not like cookie. It is cookie. I was either eating 100% sugar or airborne. Okay, Jim.
So that just kind of encapsulates how different each different time period parented or mothered their children. We go from the Victorian era, which was, just always doting on your children, to then this 1960s, which is just complete neglect of your children.
Yep. I think of, this wasn't the 1960s, but we talked about the no seatbelt thing. I just remember a picture of my uncle, my mom's oldest brother. I actually want to say this was 1961, to be honest. Of him as a baby in a car, and he's just sitting in a box. And it's like hanging from the back, and anyone who's older listening to may know what I'm talking about. And I'm like, I asked my mom, what is that? She's like, that's a car seat. I was like,
oh my gosh.
She's like, yeah, you just stuck him in a box. And I was like, well, I feel like, granted, technology wasn't the same as we are, but you think of, safety standards. You're like, well, do they not care about the children like they do now? And it's a different mentality. And it's crazy, again, how we are influenced, especially by media. I think media really played a role in these different types of trends of how we parent and what type of parenting comes out and what's accepted and what's not accepted. And that kind of, leads us into, I think, our third part here. I don't know if you want to start off first, but I can go on if you have any thoughts you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think just closing off, I guess, all the different time periods that we've touched on. And we really haven't, even though we've talked about a lot, we really have just glossed over just examples of different time periods, because motherhood and the history of motherhood obviously is so extensive and just dependent really on where you lived and during what time. And we just are trying to give a little taste of how it's been so different across the centuries. And then also just the extremes, just as we were talking about, on one extreme, there's the 1960s. And then on the other extreme, it's just the constant doting. And it just kind of brings to mind of when we're trying to think of, well, what is being a good mom then? Because that's all what we're about at Motherhood, is trying to be a good mom, not a perfect mom. So obviously the Victorian era was probably trying to be too much of a perfect mom. And then the 1960s, or if you're neglecting your children, that's being a bad mom, so they're two extremes. And it always, I'm always reminded of Aristotle and his idea of what virtue is. And he always talks about virtue being the mean between two correlated extremes. And I know that we as human beings like to be super black or white or this or that. And that's how we just like to be in general. But this whole Aristotle concept of being more in the middle is a lot more peaceful, at least for me. And it's a lot more achievable, because then you realize, okay, well, obviously neglect is bad. Obviously, like 100% doting is not really possible for most of us moms. So it's kind of somewhere in the middle. And that's always been like a really big relief to always come, to me at least, to always come back to this Aristotle concept of what virtue is. And just as you were saying, that leads us into the third point that we wanted to talk about, which is shame surrounding motherhood. And I know that that's a really big aspect surrounding motherhood as well, because moms just like shaming each other, and women. I know that, Melissa, you made that point. That's not really just a mom thing. It's a woman thing too, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially, so I'm not officially a parent, and I see this happen, whether I read it in the news, or on someone's Instagram, or I hear it from a friend, my sister. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, even I've asked my sister, why are you doing that with my niece? Like, why are you doing that? And I'm her family member. I think that speaks volumes of how we as a society feel about telling other people how to parent. Now, there is a caveat to this, and I was actually just thinking about it when I'm thinking about women versus women and the whole shame culture, because in certain cultures, it is perfectly acceptable to have, especially your elders, get involved and tell you how to raise your children. So again, just stressing that this is by no means perfect. You live somewhere else, as Emily said, and you grew up in a different time. The expectations are different. So this is not to, pile on any culture. But in America, I think it goes beyond a cultural aspect. It's not culture, it is pure shame. No matter what a mom does, even women will bring each other down in that area. So, I just always ask the question, how does this lack of female consensus hurt women as a whole? Especially when I said earlier that if you think about it, motherhood, even if you're not a mom, it's not even about maternal instinct. How this is something that should unite women no matter what. And clearly it doesn't. There's a lot of people with strong opinions on how you should raise a kid. Emily, I don't know if you have anything you want to share, if you feel comfortable sharing, but I know that there's always a lot of mom shaming out there. So please feel free to chime in if you got your own story here.
Definitely. Yeah. I think that's a really important part to talk about, the cultural differences as well. I guess I always viewed the cultures where the parents and the grandparents did get involved, since I know that tends to be what it is in a lot of Asian cultures. Is that to me always is more advice. But again, like I'm not from that culture, so I can't really attest to it. Maybe it would really annoy me if I was a part of that culture. So advice versus judgment, but again, you probably, if you did, and this is obviously, I don't know anything about that culture, but I don't know, maybe if you did want to branch off and do things differently, maybe you couldn't. And I guess that is something that we do have more of the freedom in Western civilization to be different than our parents and grandparents. We don't have to do things their way. But then a lot of times I think that they think that we should do things their way. And then that's where a lot of the tension comes in. But I wanted to read a quote from Brene Brown about motherhood and shaming, and just women in general too. So this is from an excerpt from Daring Greatly by Brene Brown. And I really loved it when I read this in her book. So she says, "You don't have to be a mother to experience mother shame. Society views womanhood and motherhood as inextricably bound. Therefore, our value as women is often determined by where we are in relation to our roles as mothers or potential mothers. Women are constantly asked why they haven't married, or if they're married, why they haven't had children. Even women who are married and have one child are often asked why they haven't had a second child. You haven't had your kids too far apart. What were you thinking? Too close? Why? That's so unfair to the kids. If you're working outside of the home, the first question is, what about the children? If you're not working, the first question is, what kind of example are you setting for your daughters? Mother shame is ubiquitous. It's a birthright for girls and women. But the real struggle for women, what amplifies shame regardless of the category, is that we are expected and sometimes desire to be perfect, yet we're not allowed to look as if we're working for it. We want to just materialize it somehow. Everything should be effortless. The expectation is to be natural beauties, natural mothers, natural leaders, and naturally good parents. And we want to belong to naturally fabulous families. Think about how much money has been made selling products that promise the natural look. And when it comes to work, we love to hear she makes it so easy or she's a natural.
Wow. I mean, I think that speaks to, like you said, anyone. And it's worth noting too. I mean, I know the beginning part of that. I get the question, why don't I have children? Am I going to have kids? Like, when do you plan on doing that? You're getting older. These seemingly rude, inappropriate questions I get asked just feels natural for people to say. I've never heard that quote. I love that. I love it. Brene Brown, I think was spot on. And it really speaks to how women just are not able to make it no matter what. And you think of celebrities and celebrity culture, which part of me wants to argue that they're the ones that really also help, with this and reinforce this idea. However, they also get mom shamed and criticized. And there really is no win, no matter what you do, no matter who you are. I think it's just, fascinating that no matter what, women just can't win.
I forgot who it was I was speaking to a few months ago, and I was making a comment about this whole aspect surrounding motherhood shame. And I was just making a comment that I wonder why men don't really experience it that much. But actually, maybe it was you that I was talking to. Now that I'm saying it out loud, maybe you'll remember this conversation if it was you. Basically, that men are more shamed in regards to their career, which is interesting to note. So it's like, what do you do? Okay, you're this, XYZ, or okay. And then men kind of feel guilty if they're just this or just that. And then they feel pride if they have a really important job title or position or something like that. So for them, it's not fatherhood. It's their career.
Right. And as we said, it kind of goes back to the 1800s sole wager earner notion that we talked about. And actually, I don't know if you heard me, I think it was us that was talking about it. I know I've talked about it with my significant other, and he mentioned that to me. There's, again, we don't have time to go into it and, men and their role and how that's changed as well and expectations. But the pandemic has brought out something interesting, especially for mothers that I've noticed. And I've seen headlines about this. Women also do not demand men do more. Sometimes women also take it upon themselves to just carry the burden by themselves. Women are doing, during the pandemic, majority childcare and chores, and probably working too. And it's, everyone's dynamic is different. So this is not to judge someone's dynamic, but I always ask, my friends, well, have you asked your significant other if they're going to help? And some women may not be in a position to ask that. So, there's a lot there that I think we need to, as a society, support moms, especially the ones that may not have internal familial support or spousal support, because especially the pandemic has really highlighted, I think, the inequities between the haves and have-nots, and who's surviving and who's really just barely scraping by.
That's a really good point to make sure that you vocalize it. I know that that's a common recommendation that's made to women in general, is that men can't read your mind. And so it's really important to vocalize and say, like, this is what I need, and just be very specific about it too. I know that since my husband and I, obviously, we don't have, I mean, my mom does help a lot, so that's nice to really have her help. But other than that, like we don't have a regular babysitter and we don't have daycare, that sort of thing. And so the evening, and when the kids go to bed is really important to have that routine down. And so I've been trying to get that down. And then I realized that I was kind of expecting my husband to read my mind on what I wanted the routine to be. And then recently I was like, okay, no, I need to write this down and say, okay, dinner for the kids is this time, like bath is going to be this time, like dinner is going to, or bedtime is going to be this time. And then I'll do these and then you do those, and then kind of like go team divide and go do it or whatever.
Right.
But I think it is really important to have that conversation and really spell it out in those clear terms, so that your husband or significant other can see, oh, wow, like that's a lot when you put it all on paper, like everything that has to be done in the evening to get the kids to bed. That's a lot of stuff. And if you're doing that by yourself and then you're just shouting random things for your husband to do, like he probably doesn't understand. Like, I don't think that my husband literally like fully understood everything that I was trying to accomplish in the evening. But then once it's all laid out, it's just so easy. It's like, okay, wow, that's so easy. It's just the plans on paper, or in this instance, it was a text message. Like the plan is written down in a text message, and then it's so easy after that. It just was a lot easier.
Sorry, I just wanted to add on really quick. I think of my dad. My dad would be considered progressive for his time. He's no longer with us. He passed away some years ago, but my dad did everything. So I grew up really like in a kind of the other end of the spectrum. My mom would be not considered domesticated at all. Hates cooking, doesn't really do it. I take after her in a lot. I like cleaning though. I find it cathartic. But it's this idea that if we do not demand more of whoever we're with, and again, doesn't necessarily have to be a man, but whoever you're with and whoever's helping you out, then why would they meet demands when they're not even there? I think, if you expect very little of someone, they're going to meet that expectation. And again, it's never perfect. Obviously, there's, but I think, like I said, communication really, women have to talk, they have to say out loud that they need help. And I think maybe there's even shame in that women can't even ask for help without being judged.
That's a really good point that you brought up, that whether or not there's shame in asking for help, because I haven't confirmed this and asked my friends directly, but I have a couple friends that I get the feeling that they feel like they're a failure if they ask for help. And again, I'm not saying that that's 100% what it is, because I haven't asked, because I don't feel like it's my place to ask yet. But I just get the feeling that they feel like a failure if they would say, hey, this is hard, or like, I can't do this all. Whereas me, I'm like I'm not afraid to say like, hey, I need a break. Like I've been watching the kids for 8 hours, 10 hours a day. I'm like, hey, I'm done. I don't know. Maybe it's that I just don't have any shame when it comes to that aspect. I don't know if that's good or bad. But also, one of my other good friends, she pointed out that it's not healthy when you don't listen to your body or your own needs. If you're just pushing yourself and just saying, no, I can watch the kids, like you watch the kids all day while your husband's working. Because right now I'm on maternity leave, technically, even though I'm kind of working. But anyway, so I'm like on maternity leave, but I'm like watching the kids all day. And then when my husband's done working, like, of course he needs a break too, because he was just working all day. So I get that too. So I try to allow for that too, so you can do things like work out, those sorts of things. But on the other flip side of it, it's like, I've been working all day too. So you have to kind of balance that at the end of the day. And I mean, I don't feel guilty at all just saying like, I want a break, or, I need to do this, or I want to take a shower for whatever and put on makeup if it makes me feel better, even though my husband's like, well, we're not going anywhere. And my husband is great. He doesn't care if I wear makeup. I'm like, well, I like wearing it, so sometimes I want to wear it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, because I think no matter what, if you're, like you said, if you're a mom or not, the expectation of how women look, people on the outside are always commenting. Sometimes it's not always for the other person. Sometimes it's just about how you feel, how you want your inside to match the outside and vice versa. So, but it's really interesting you said that, because I found an article from Naperville Counseling, and it talks about, if women, and especially mothers, they don't take care of themselves. They're shamed and degraded at every level. How that affects their own mental health can affect children in the long run too. So this idea that, moms have to take care of themselves first. And I've seen it in my sister. She at one point ran herself in the ground, and I'm like, if something happens to you, that's terrible for your daughter. That's terrible for my niece. And so, moms, you have to take care of yourselves. However, that needs to happen, whatever capacity, because your, general well-being and mental well-being, your kids depend upon that too. So I think, like you said, it's just really important that women are able to take care of themselves, and no matter what that looks like.
That's an important point that you mentioned, that children recognize it too, and that it impacts them, because in the long run, everything that you do as a mother, you're really teaching your children through example, because children learn through example more than anything that you could ever teach them verbally. That's actually something that Chris Jablonski mentioned. She was a podcast guest in our episode on positive parenting. She mentioned that, and I forgot what episode number it is, but you should just, if you're listening, go ahead and check out that episode because it was really good on that subject. But basically, she said that children learn through your actions. And so if you're not taking care of yourself, then your children, when they're adults or they're moms, then they might not take care of themselves because they think that's the role model of motherhood that they're seeing. They're seeing you constantly like doing, and then not taking care of yourself or not making sure that you're healthy. And then they're going to do the same thing. So whether it's taking some time to go exercise, or an example for me is just sitting down and eating. I remember when Kate was about a year old, that I just felt like super run down and just not energetic. And it's because I wasn't even taking time to like sit down and like eat breakfast and lunch when I was watching Kate during the day. And because she was being in her toddler stage of just basically being like a little tyrant, like a lot of toddlers are, right? Just demanding things. And I was just catering to every single little thing she wanted. And then finally, when I was just feeling so run down and I just realized, okay, I have to sit down and eat. But I explained it to her. I was just very verbal about it. I said, well, Kate, mama, you just ate. Now mama has to eat, and that really sticks with kids because then she realized that. And then when she saw me eating, she's like, oh, okay, you're eating. And then I remind her, say, okay, mom, this is mama's time to eat. So mama's sitting down and mama's eating. And then she would recognize that that's what I was doing. And then she respected that. And it just made me so proud that she realized that that's what I was doing after I told her several times. And then I would remind her, and that she recognized that I was taking care of myself. But again, so hopefully in the future, when she's a mom, that she realized, okay, I remember when my mom sat down to eat, besides just like always being a busybody and doing stuff. But yeah, I mean, that is really important to make sure that you are giving that example, instead of just running yourself into the ground. There's no shame in that, or there shouldn't be shame in that, really.
Absolutely. I know we're coming up on time here, but I wanted to just mention, we'll have I want to give some links too. I know people, if they don't always have the resources to help them, they don't have like the family support. I think that's always key. If people don't have family support, it's like, well, how do I take care of myself and my kid at the same time?
Right.
To give some, links maybe for people who need some extra support and love in that area. Because it's tough. It's, it takes a village, and we no longer utilize the village, mindset. So, yeah.
That's a really important point. I would love to talk about that in another episode too, just the village of motherhood and how it's not really there anymore, because that is, I know, what puts a lot of strain on a lot of moms when you don't have that community aspect. And again, looking historically at motherhood, just as we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, even the hunter-gatherer stage, I mean, even they had babysitters, if for lack of better term,
right.
Aloe parents of people to watch the kids, so the moms could go do during I can't talk right now. The lack of sleep of a newborn, so doing different things. That's what I meant to say. Before we close, I wanted to play this quote from Mean Girls, just because I think it's super relatable and also really on topic.
Hey, how are my best girlfriends? Hey, Mrs. George. This is Katie.
Hello, sweetheart. Welcome to our home. Just
want you to know, if you need anything, don't be shy, okay? There are no rules in this house. I'm not like a regular mom. I'm a cool mom. Right, Regina?
That to me just really encapsulates a lot of shame surrounding motherhood too, because we feel this pressure to not be a regular mom, but a cool mom, or we constantly think, oh, at least for me, when I first became a mom, oh, I'm a mom. Now I have to look the mom way or just be the mom way or whatever that is. And
there's no nothing with it either.
Yeah, exactly. So that's just another layer of shame when we don't feel like we live up to that cool mom standard, or we feel like we're put in this category of being a certain type of mom.
Yep, I completely agree. I won't dwell too long. I think the clip kind of speaks for itself. And any millennial who grew up watching Mean Girls back in high school knows that whole movie and that whole mother-daughter dynamic. So again, it speaks for itself. But no matter, I think my only closing thought is, no matter who you are, what your background is, how you look or don't look, there's so many other women who are just like you in the same boat. And, hopefully, every mom can remember that if they wake up and just have an extra hard day. So.
Exactly. So again, as we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the goal for this particular episode was just to show how motherhood has existed throughout the centuries and how it's changed over time and how it's evolved, just to help make you feel a little bit better, reduce some mom guilt, and don't feel as guilty if maybe you think you're not spending as much time with your kids, or you have interests outside of your kids, or if you just want to be a stay-at-home mom and, just constantly be there for your children. That's obviously like a really good way to be a mom too. So it's just basically to highlight the different aspects of motherhood and different ways to be a mother, so that you can feel confident and happy in whichever motherhood path and journey that you choose.
Yeah, completely agree. By the way, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. This was fun. Drag me in anytime.
Yeah, thanks for putting up. I guess I just always pull you in just random different things. So I really appreciate you being such a trooper too, and always even doing this video, which I guess it kind of worked out. What's your verdict on the video?
I'm a fan. I've been on video though, going to school, and Zoom has been my life, and other platforms. So I think I'm just broken of it now. I'm just whatever you guys want.
That's true. Yeah. I guess we're kind of used to it now after 2020 with all the Zoom and everything. So
true. Yeah.
Well, great. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys next time.
Bye.